Aloha from Hawaii Island. For those of you who don't know me, I am Jonathan Roach, one of your associate conference ministers, and I live on Hawaii Island. And today I have the pleasure of moderating our panel. I'm going to start by giving a short summary of the two articles by theologian Susan Beaumont that our team has asked us to reflect upon today. And then I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves quickly so we can get right into our question and discussions. This year, the formational missional team centered our reflection around two articles from theologian Susan Beaumont. The first article is entitled Leading in an In-Between Season, and the second is Innovating into an Unknown Future. And Christian is going to post the links to these articles in the chat after the panel. Oh, they are already up. And in these articles, Susan argues that the usual tools of leadership aren't effective during times like the one the church finds itself in now. She calls this a liminal season, which is a fancy way of saying that we are in between models of how God is calling us to be the church. She suggests that the old models are ending, but that the new models have not taken shape yet. So we are in that difficult phase of being in between times, a liminal time between models. Beaumont argues that many of us as church leaders don't know where we are going, that many of us are feeling lost, confused, filled with anxiety and stress, and sometimes many of us are feeling like we are failing. We are letting God down. We are letting our congregations down. But she reminds us of the danger of going backwards. Because whenever models start to fall apart, there is the danger that we will go back to something that worked in the past. Let's go back to when it was working. Let's go back to the 1980s or the 1950s or whenever the golden age was for our congregations. Instead, Beaumont argues that we need to break out of old habits and engage in a spirit-filled group discernment. In the United Church of Christ, we call this listening for our still speaking God. Beaumont writes that in liminal seasons, it is important to adopt a leadership stance of presence, an orientation of openness, awe, and wonder. This requires three fundamental shifts in our thinking: from knowing to unknowing, from advocating to attending, and from striving to surrender. She suggests that we need to engage in lots of storytelling, listening to each other for the voice of God's wisdom through the other, innovation, dialogue, prayerful reflection, and experimenting to help find what God is bringing forth as a new thing. She suggests that we will need to unlearn what has worked in the past and relearn new processes to look at the assumptions that we are making about ministry and what is successful ministry. And now with that short introduction, I am going to invite each of our 4 panelists to introduce themselves.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Reverend Tino Cordova with the Yao Church here on Maui.
Aloha, everyone. My name is Cassie. I use she, her pronouns, and I guess primarily my ministry is with Faith Action for Community Equity. I'm a community organizer there, and I also attend Pearl City Community Church, and I live here in town on Oahu. Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Aloha, everyone. My name is Debbie Wong Yuen. I'm the licensed pastor at Kaua'au Congregational Church on the southern end of the Big Island.
Good morning. My name is John Carr, and I'm the pastor of Liminal Christian Church on Kauai.
Thank you, panelists. I so appreciate you being here. I so thank you for all the work that you have put in your preparation. And the first question, we want to start with Tino, and we're asking, what is the reality that you perceive your church is facing today?
One of the major components that we are facing is burnout. And that's the loss of members that may or have not come back after 2 years, the loss of revenue, loss of tithing, and so the loss of people to do the ministry of our church. So those are just a few that come to mind.
I think at my church, I think we're facing burnout as well. I think in addition to that, there's a lot of fatigue and there's a lot of loss, you know, both as a community, but also personally, whether that be family members or community members, or whether that also be, you know, our services aren't what they used to be, our activities aren't what they used to be. We're not sure how our kapuna are doing in our congregation. So I think there's just a lot of kind of collective grieving that's happening at the church.
At Kaua'au Church, basically, we're going through all that same issues. It's just the uncertainty of everything, the burnout, just the unknown. So, you know, it's just, you kind of feel like it's day by day, especially when, you know, all the rules change and you don't know which rules to follow, which way to go. So it's just the uncertainty that's just really makes it hard for everything.
Yeah, I think that these articles were really very perceptive at sharing the reality that we face in describing liminality, because we are in this in-between season where there's no, you know, it's not a fully formed vision of what and who we are anymore, and it's not yet a vision of that either. And so I thought it was really good at describing the reality that my church is facing.
The second question I have for our panel today is, what are you or your congregation most fearful about? Is there anything that's keeping you stuck? Debbie, could we start with you on this one?
Kaua'au is a small membership congregation. So I think for us, what we're fearful about, we are doing right now, what we're doing outdoor drive-in worship service, where we set up our worship area on the sidewalk under the eave of the building. And our members who come, they drive up closest to the building on the lawn area, and they listen to the service through their radio. We also send out the worship. We record it by Zoom and email it out to members who do not have Facebook. So they have all these options. They can either come in person through the drive-up worship. They can watch worship live through Facebook or later, or watching the worship through the Zoom recording later. So with that, I think our fear is people have gotten so used to just staying home in the comfort of home and watching the worship service whenever they're ready for it, whenever they want to watch it. So when the time comes that we gather again where we can have in-person worship, will they come back? Or will they feel so used to just, oh, I can watch it later in my comfort anytime during the week? So I think that's the biggest fear we have. Will they come back to be together again?
I think the fears that I've perceived it in my congregation are fairly similar, but different enough that I'd like to speak on it. My church is a Japanese heritage congregation, and most of the members are related in one way or another. And there's a fear among the kapuna that the younger generation isn't going to get involved. And I think that this fear has been around for a little while. And these past 2 years of COVID have just really exacerbated it, because we haven't gathered together in a way that allows for our kids to really participate in worship in the way that my congregation desires it to happen. And so a lot of the families that we had who were engaged have really kind of, I don't know if fallen by the wayside is the right word, but they have really stopped attending worship. And so I think that has really put a fear of the future. You know, what is going to happen if we can't get these younger people to continue on with this congregation. And so I think that drives several of the things that that my church is going through right now, is trying to figure out a lot of the questions. And one of them that I found helpful in this Susan Beaumont article is not asking how do we do things, but rather just becoming an adaptive learner. But I think that my church is sort of, because of this fear of maybe the unknown or of losing its grip on who it is, has caused it to start asking how do we, a lot more than just saying, okay, you know, what can we learn from this time of liminality? And so I think that has some fear attached to it. My personal fear is a little bit different from my congregations, and that is that we have adapted our church services in such a way that we're far less participatory. So because we don't have singing, and we don't have people speaking in a call and response. And so it's become much more of a spectator sport. And that is a fear of mine, because if we stop becoming participants in worship and get comfortable in just watching, then we miss out on the beauty of a community coming together to participate in the mission of God as one. And so my fear is that would if increase and kind of become the norm.
We in our trial association here on Maui, there was one instance where we gathered and we talked about Boogerman's return to Pharaoh's Egypt. And one of the things that I fear is those members that are coming back believe they're going to be returning to Pharaoh's Egypt of what was. And the church that we were in 2020, in March of 2020, no longer exists. There's a new and different kind of church now, one that has cameras, and one that is social, and one that has a ministry that reaches out to the community with food distribution, and one that does not have the kupuna coming back yet, because there's still many of the kupuna who are fearful of coming back, gathering in large places. So how do we keep in contact with one another? So that's one of the things that has been fear of ours, that they think they're going to come back to sameness.
Yeah, I think similar to what has been named already, I think there's a lot of fear that, you know, as we move forward into the future, the church is not going to be the same as it has been before. I think there's fear that maybe the church's identity is shifting or kind of becoming irrelevant in the community. And I think there's fear about, are we stewarding our resources well that we have right now? And can we do that as a community together in making those decisions? But I think one thing I wanted to name too is in all of that fear, I think there's also an underlying like sense of grief, like really, really deep grief as churches are trying to figure out, and this is not just at my church, I feel like I see this at other churches that we work with Faith Action, of people grappling with in change. We're having to grieve that our church identity is changing. And there were things that were really beautiful that were happening that can continue to, you know, I think stay in the change. And there are things that we need to like let go of and open our hands and say, thank you, God, for the time and the season that we had this. And there's something shifting here. So yeah, I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the grief, with the fear, excuse me, is the grief part of it as well.
Thank you all. Cassie, if we could begin with you this time, what do you think we can experiment with?
I think the short answer is everything. One quote that I'm guided by often is Adrienne Marie Brown. She's like a writer and activist. She says, what you give energy to grows. And that's what I feel excited about in the church. Like if someone is excited about doing a book study or handing things out to the community, let's try it and just see. Last week at our church, we gave away Kalo, we gave away Huli to the community. And there was just a young person who said like, Cassie, I'm going to pop up. Like, we're just going to do it. We don't have to wait for all these things to happen or figure out, are we going to do it consistently or whatever? And so we did. And his friends came by, kids walking in the neighborhood came by and just got to interact with the church. And so we don't know, you know, where that's going exactly, but I think just kind of planting seeds and nurturing, like where are the places that the energy is growing and what are people excited about still, you know, in the midst of so much change.
One of the things is, how do we minister with less people coming back? How do we do ministry with less people? One of the things that I experiment is, how do we downsize? How do we focus our ministry not on buildings, but on people? I took the adaptive leadership training sponsored by the UCC conference, and how do we move forward and not be afraid to fail? So try things and just go for it. And if we fail, how do we adapt as leaders and change midway, as Susan suggests, also being able to change midway. So, you know, do we sell our buildings and create affordable housing?
I just kind of wanted to echo that idea of experimenting with everything. I read a book a little while ago called Edison Churches, and it has the idea that Edison can like tried and failed to get the filament right on the light bulb. And when they asked him, you know, how can you keep going? And he said, well, I just, you know, learned however many ways to do it wrong, and now I've learned one way to do it right. And so I think even though it's really hard as we are experimenting with all of these things that maybe we haven't toyed with before, we need to not become discouraged because they don't work, you know, because it's okay, like Tino said, it's okay to embrace that failure. So I just kind of want to echo what those guys said about experimenting with everything and being okay with not having success right away.
I think for us, being a small membership congregation, we've been trying to experiment with different options to have worship, to, you know, we kind of have our fundraisers, and so try to having online fundraisers, and just sometimes not really knowing the outcome, how people are feeling. So when you don't have that communication, that togetherness, you know, you kind of feel like a failure when people don't respond and don't let you know. So yeah, you know, it's just still waiting and listening to what God is speaking, telling us to do, and then just go for it. So if we hear an idea, we talk about it, and then we try to experiment with it and just leave it in God's hands and see where he takes us with it. So I think that the fear is not when we don't get the feedback, we don't know how people are perceiving what we're doing and if it's helping them.
Thank you all for those insightful responses. John, if we could start with you for the next question. What did you find the most helpful from the resources from Susan Beaumont that we read?
So I actually found a lot of things that were helpful in it. I just putting words to, I was familiar with the phrase of liminality before, but I hadn't really, I guess, articulated that was the season that we're in, this in-between season of kind of like not yet, and what is behind us, what is to come. So both articles were very helpful. But I think that the one I referenced it a little bit ago, but the one that I found most helpful were the how to break the habit of using "how do we" language. She says that the word "how" may tempt you to design technical solutions to problems that are still unsolvable, and that's something that I fall into the trap of a lot. It's like, how do we do this, and how do we get to this area? Like I do try to think of solutions to problems that are unsolvable, and so just to be reminded that it's okay to not do that, but to be an adaptive learner and take a step back. And she says that it requires experimentation, iteration, and intentional reflection on lessons learned. And so to be able to do that is extremely important. And I think that was one of the most helpful parts of these articles for me.
In her articles, what really grabbed me when she said, our job as leaders is to participate in the process of unfolding, to be led by the future itself until eventually a new coherence emerges, one that points the way to a more plannable future. In another article, she says, draw upon the practice of discernment rather than forge ahead with false confidence. And what I got out of that was discernment. We're reacting to everything that's happening around us. The past 2 years is just we're reacting to mandates, reacting to this. And I think if we ask God to show us his purpose, what is God calling us to do at this time that we're in right now, this time of uncertainty? What is God's purpose for our individual church today? If we come up with ideas to experiment, go to God and discern his will. Will it work? Is it something for us? Of course, what one church does is not going to be good for the other church. So again, it's discerning God's will and what would be best for us, and really taking time to listen to him as he's speaking to us.
I think for me, the line that stuck with me was liminal learning being cyclical. So instead of focusing on like what's point A and point B, thinking about how do we just kind of be present in the liminal space or time, and also learn how to, be church well together. So yeah, I feel like we as a church have been doing a lot of reflecting on like, where have we been and what has God been doing? Where are we going? But also, who are we right now? And it matters a lot, like how we even share space together, like how we're in meetings, how we treat each other, how we're taking care of each other. I think that part for me really matters in the presence as we're learning together. But like, to me, Jesus's ministry was anything but efficient. I don't know if anyone would push back against that, but he was not linear, right? He was about sitting with people. He was about going place to place, and the disciples didn't even get it. They were always going in circles about things, but they were learning and they were eating together and they were healing, right? So those are kind of the things I think about, is like being present in the liminal space can be a joy as well.
For me, what really stuck out in the article was when she says, if the leaders are going far in front of the people, then no one is following. And everyone knows me. I'm a big extrovert and I go 100 miles an hour. And the members have had to tell me, Pastor, you need to slow down. And so that's a good way of saying, I need to remember that I'm leading a lot of the kupuna also, that they can't run 100 miles an hour like I do, even though in my joy of ministry that I have to be able to travel and slow down.
The next thing I am interested in for our collective wisdom is how do we best support each other? How do we best support other congregations? How do we best support our moderators, our treasurers, our church leaderships? How do we best support our people in ministry, including yourselves?
One of the things when I was reading the article and then reflecting back on the last 2 years is I've created a safe space for people to grieve of what they lost, for people to grieve their loss of a loved one. The congregation had a safe space to come and vent. But in the last 2 years, I don't remember that I created a safe space for myself to also grieve, because I've been so busy making sure that their space was created, making sure that they had a place to vent when things didn't go right on their end during virtual worship service. But I've been so busy running 100 miles an hour to make sure that all the video and audio equipment worked, that everything went correctly, that all the liturgy was done. And I haven't really had that time to just stop and create that same space for myself as the pastor. And so I'm hoping to do that now over Lent.
I think one of the ways that churches can support each other is through the sharing of spaces. So I know on island here, there are some churches that don't have a regular place to worship. And that I foresee a future where multiple churches will potentially need to share a space. And so to figure out healthy and worshipful ways to do that and to partner in ministry can be a really wonderful thing to do right now.
I mean, off the top of my head, I think in every space, church and nonprofit, literally like investing in our leaders, just so, you know, we can live healthy lives, kind of like Pastor Tino was saying. I also like, Pastor Tino, what you were saying about slowing down. I think that's really good, and slowing down and taking the time for us to even, you know, have coffee with each other or go walk around and see, you know, what other churches are in our neighborhood and what are they doing as well, and how can we support each other in our work. Because oftentimes we have the same goals, right, or similar things that we're working on that we can support each other.
I think for me, it's just the reaching out. If others would reach out to their leaders and say, can I help with anything? Is there something that, or just come on and say, hey, I can do that, take a break. And that's what I miss, is just, you know, people not offering, is they just figure, okay, she'll do it all. She has it all. She has to do it all. But it's yeah, sometimes you just kind of feel so left alone. So if they would just come out and offer, you know, Kaho, you need to take a break. Let me do it. That would be just so refreshing to hear that.
Jonathan, sorry, can I share one more idea that I have? I think that I've heard from a lot of colleagues in clergy that they feel like punching bags recently because people are really run down and hurting from this pandemic. And so they, people tend to lash out when they feel like they have a safe space. And so a lot of my clergy colleagues have felt like they've been attacked. And so I would say one way that clergy can be supported is if other people see that happening, that we don't normalize it. You know, we don't say it's okay to lash out and to make a punching bag of church leaders, because it's not okay. Even though we're in a difficult season, it's not an okay practice to do that. And so I think that's one way we as church leaders can support each other, is if we see it happening to someone else in our in our church, we can push back against that.
Thank you, John. That's a vital insight. I really appreciate that. So another question is, tomorrow is Transfiguration Sunday. How do you approach transfiguration? Unlearning, learning about a new identity, discerning the realities that might be on their way.
I think so. My thought process around Transfiguration Sunday this year is, well, it's actually kind of shifted from one end to another, and with everything going on in Ukraine, and how do we speak about transformation and transfiguration in a meaningful way that can also push back against the horrors of war. But I think I see the transfiguration and transformation as being hand in hand. And so this stepping into a liminal space in order to step into a new way of being is something that I kind of keep it in my mind. This idea that that we are transforming and changing, just as Jesus was transfigured on the Mount. We too are in this process of maybe day by day looking a little bit more like Jesus, hopefully. So that's kind of been my idea of how transfiguration and transformation play into the liminal spaces that Susan Beaumont brings up, and kind of what this whole season really brings to the foreground.
My sermon title for tomorrow is Following Jesus's Coattails. And I'm focused on the journey up that mountain. I'm wondering every difficult step that it has been for the last 2 years, every step going up this mountain against an unseeable virus, but seeing that light up on top of the mountain continue to encourage us every step of the way. But I like to do imagery, and I'm imagining each one of us on our own separate mountains, 6 feet away from each other, with masks on, going up to that mountain and reaching there, and finally being able to remove our masks.
Thank you. So another question I have is, Beaumont writes about unlearning, and unlearning is really hard. And the older I become, the harder it's become for me to unlearn something, or to work with people who are convinced their way is the right way, and asking them to unlearn something that's worked for them in the past. So, panelists, how do you approach unlearning for yourself and for others?
For myself, I usually start with just having a posture every day of openness and kind of, perpetual curiosity. So starting with, if I hear something that I feel kind of tension with in something somebody else is saying, kind of wondering about, where is that coming from, and what wisdom is there to learn in the tension that I'm feeling, or in the difference that I'm hearing there. Yeah, I think that's something I try to hold as like a posture of openness in that.
For me, is to really listen and to try to understand what the person is saying, and instead of reacting, taking a step back and really thinking about whatever the situation is before reacting, and just putting my trust in God to help me understand what the situation is, and not to react and to feel like I don't trust the situation or the person, but to just let go and let God lead me in the way of whatever this situation is.
For me, I've studied cross-cultural communication and sociology and anthropology, and been in several circumstances where I have been in cross-cultural places, and this time period really feels like a time of being kind of forced into a cross-cultural experience. This time period of COVID, like you've got the kind of culture shock of this newness, and so anytime that has happened to me, I have had to kind of check myself, check my preconceived assumptions and my thoughts, even about myself and who I am and what I believe. So just like kind of questioning everything that I thought I knew, because I think that we all kind of have this idea of ethnocentrism about us, you know, that who we are and the culture that we're in is the right one. And so this time period has sort of helped me to start questioning and unlearning that again and again and again. That I don't have all of the answers, and I don't even have all of the questions. I like sometimes I don't even know what questions to ask to get to the next stage, whatever even the next stage is. And so it's been kind of like it's been a kind of like, the only thing I can compare it to is a cross-cultural experience, and it is been just a period of forced unlearning and deconstruction. And deconstruction is and can be really good, but we have to replace it with something. Like, you can't just have this deconstructed church building and then nothing to fill it with. And so I haven't yet constructed anything in the ways that COVID has deconstructed and helped me to unlearn. So that's kind of one of the things that I'm looking forward to, I think.
One of the things that the congregation had to unlearn was that there's more than one way to do worship. They were stuck on the same form of worship. And so this gave me a chance to try new things, virtual. And now when they came back last year, they actually liked how even the worship changed, but it's still something that's meaningful, moving for them. And so they had to unlearn that there's more than one way, and giving them an opportunity to be creative in worship. And one thing that I had to also learn was that even when we do things virtual, I can't do this by myself. It takes a whole team to get this done.
There were some credible answers there. Mahalo nui. You are smart people. I really appreciate you all. We're heading into our last 5 minutes of our panel, and I want to pose one last question. And many of you hit on it in the last few minutes. How do you practice group discernment? What models do you suggest? What models have worked for you? What models do you want to innovate with around group discernment? How do we gather together and listen for God?
I think we're doing that right now. I think this is a great way to gather as a whole community, and I think you'll get more participation. But we also need to remember those who are not capable or able or media savvy to link in lists. How do we keep them engaged? I'm looking around and I'm wondering, where are the youth in this? I don't see very much youth engaged in this process. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to continue to strive for, is re-engage the youth, myself included.
I think group discernment is an extremely necessary aspect of discernment, really. But I think that one of the things is it takes time and it takes trust. It's kind of like a muscle. Like if you're not using it, then it's not something you can just jump into. So I think it takes practice. But one thing that I kind of, as I watch my council my church council interact with each other, and try to practice healthy group discernment. One thing that I remember whenever things get contentious, or there's some disagreements and things like that, is something that Kahu Barry Mick told me, is that you just have to remember to love them. And so that aspect sticks with me every time I'm in a council meeting, is just remembering to love people, even though they're disagreeing, and maybe I'm disagreeing with them. And so I think one of the healthiest aspects of group discernment is listening to people, even though you disagree with them, and loving them. I think we have such a desire to have people agree with us all the time. I know I do. And kind of the idea is that I would sort of almost rather be in an echo chamber than have people disagree with me. But that disagreement is really what helps draw us to new heights, and to help me, especially me, see different perspectives from other people. And so I think that listening to other people is one of the highest qualities, and it's not something that happens all the time. And I think somebody just posted, how do we practice it? I think the actual, like, by doing it, but then failing and not being discouraged too much when we fail, and just trying again and again. And it's going to be hard. I don't think that there's anything easy about group discernment, at least not in my experience.
I think one thing that my mind goes to immediately is like assessing the power in the room, actually. So who is the person that, does it feel like they actually hold more weight in the room about what they say? And if that's so, how do we make sure that we assess, that we're all discerning together, and that we all have something valuable to contribute, because God is speaking to each of us, and then can speak collectively to all of us. Second thing, I think it's related to what Pastor Tino brought up before, is, who is not in the room? And if they're not in the room, then what does that mean about what we're hearing or not hearing in our discernment? And then the last thing I was thinking of that's like really practical is I got to attend a retreat with some folks from the Church of the Nazarene, and they were learning circle processes, which I think comes out of different Indigenous practices. And one of the things that they always start with in the circle is setting values and setting guidelines together as a group. And it takes a lot of time, I think, to like build those relationships and to build that trust. But it's so worth the while, because then I think everyone feels like, oh, I have a space here, and I can speak honestly and kindly, and people are going to receive that because they value what I have to say, and I value what they have to say. So I think when we understand the power dynamics more, it can become easier for us to talk more freely with one another and listen.
So I want to thank our panelists. You have been incredible. I have pages of notes, insights that I want to dig deeper in. And I would just invite all of our people in our audience today to post your appreciation for our panelists in the chat.
I too want to thank you very much, panelists, and Reverend Roach, for your insights. And I mean, I learned a lot just listening to you, and I felt the commitment and the love for the church coming from all of you, and the love of your people. So thank you so much for that.